So, did you know when it comes to Gnosticism and these early sects of Christianity, that there are books that were discovered 200 years ago, well before the Nag Hammadi library ever became a thing, well before the Dead Sea Scrolls were ever unearthed. And these particular books happen to talk about how to almost defeat the evil that's in our world? If you don't know about that, then welcome to the Books of Jeu, and of course the Pistis Sophia. I'm going to read an introduction from this book published through the Brill Society by Aaron Evans, which does an excellent job describing Gnosticism and these two books in particular. And I'm going to give my commentary on it. And the reason that I'm going to read the introduction is because the way that the introduction is put together in this book, it really sums up what Gnosticism is in a way that is broken down so that regular folks can read it. So with that being said, if you're interested in finding out some in-depth research on Gnosticism, well, watch this video and we will learn about it together. Let's roll the introduction and let's get into it. All right, so thank you, Aaron Evans, for all of the hard work that you've done with this 295-page book and summarizing it the way that you have. Because most people hear about Gnosticism from a fucking TikTok video where there's usually a person who's very charismatic and will say something like, "What is Gnosticism? A sect of early Christianity that believed in dualism." And meanwhile, this title of what Gnosticism is lumping a bunch of groups of Christianity into one and then giving them all brand new names, which makes it very hard to keep track of who these Gnostics all are or what Gnosticism really is. And in this introduction, that is what Aaron Evans does, is breaks down the interpretation of these two particular Gnostic books, but of Gnosticism in general. So we're going to read it. Like I said, I'm going to give my commentary on it, and let's learn a little bit about Gnosticism. This is what you can find on my YouTube channel here. I break down the research by showing you the actual texts. I don't like to necessarily be someone who's overly charismatic. Sometimes I'm just a little bit of a nerd. And that's it. Let's get into it. Okay. The Books of Jeu and Pistis Sophia are Coptic texts that were brought to the West over 200 years ago. Again, side note, way before the Nag Hammadi library was ever discovered, we already had Gnostic texts that were dug up. Y'all just didn't hear about them. In this time, relatively little scholarly attention has been given to them, in particular in comparison to the scholarship surrounding the texts of the Nag Hammadi library, which were discovered less than a century ago. So essentially, the Books of Jeu, especially the Books of Jeu, almost nobody has studied, even though these happen to be books on, as Aaron Evans says here, books on eternity, books on how to defeat the demiurge. Like, the books of all books of Gnosticism should be studied, because these ones are the ones giving so many answers, and yet, like Aaron Evans says, relatively little scholarly attention has been given to these particular books, especially in comparison to the books we regularly hear about, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Judas, the Nag Hammadi library, etc., etc. Although these texts here, these two, the Books of Jeu and the Pistis Sophia, are largely recognized as closely related to one another, they have received only cursory discussion, primarily relating to the Pistis Sophia alone, or a very brief overview skimming the contents of both. And there have not been any systematic treatments of their whole contents or contexts since the discovery of Nag Hammadi. And that's what Aaron Evans decided to do. she literally, or he, I don't even know if Aaron Evans is a male or a female. Sorry about that. I was more interested in what she was researching or what he was researching. It's got to be a she. I'm sorry. What they, good use of the pronoun. I was more interested in what they were researching than them themselves. And so I'm sure they can appreciate that to some degree. But whoever Aaron Evans is, let's just see for the sake of it. Pretty sure it's a woman, but I found her thesis to get her master's, her Doctor of Philosophy from Edinburgh University. She's been studying this for time, man. She went and got her PhD between 2011 and 2012. Good for her. Oh, I'm such a dumbass. I have seen her before. My favorite channel, Esoterica, had a full-on live stream with her, and as you can see by the little red icon in the bottom, or timestamp, I was watching some of her video with Esoterica's Dr. Sledge, who I happen to be a Patreon member of, his Patreon. That's where I first learned about it. No wonder she's, got her name all over the things that I'm finding here. She's one of the only people who's practically studied the Books of Jeu. So yes, 'tis a woman. Don't mind me having a blonde moment. But let's get back to it anyways. Let's read. God, I'm probably going to have to read her PhD and her thesis now that I found that too. Or her PhD thesis. Whew. All right. So, she's dope. Aaron Evans is the shit. Okay. Where was I at here? Oh yeah, that's right. That's what her book is doing. Remember, it says, most of the time, there's only been cursory discussions or even people who are skimming the context about the Pistis Sophia or the Books of Jeu. But what she wanted to do is she wanted to collect a kind of way of looking at the contents systematically. Pretty much to break down these books in a table of contents and discuss each one of them. So that's why she created this particular book. As it says, this book will fill this gap in scholarship. It presents the case that the Books of Jeu and the Pistis Sophia are representative texts from a distinct Christian Gnostic group or community. Analyzing each text in turn, it will show that, although each work has distinctive attributes, demonstrating development of ideas and reflecting a changing cultural environment, back in the early days of Christianity, this body of text does in fact present a relatively consistent system of cosmology, theology, and ritual practice. It examines the wide variety of syncretistic elements woven into a system and paints a picture of a group, the early Christians, working to gain followers in a competitive religious environment. So what is Gnosticism? Here's the big question. This book refers to the texts in question as Gnostic. So again, the text in question in this particular book is the Book of Jeu and the Pistis Sophia, or the Books of Jeu and the Pistis Sophia. We are going to refer to them as Gnostic, but as Aaron Evans says, this is a contentious term. The word Gnostic is a contentious term. Many books and articles have been written about what Gnosticism might be, or what constitutes a Gnostic group or ideology, despite the wide variety in opinion on what it means for a text to be Gnostic. However, on the occasions they are cited, the Books of Jeu and the Pistis Sophia, having been universally called Gnostic. In non-specialist works, in older scholarship preceding the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library, and in more recent works since the modern debate about Gnosticism really began. This shows that despite the wide variety of thought on how the term Gnostic should be defined, somehow scholars have always determined that these texts in particular fall into this category. Defining the term anew is not the goal of the present work, but it will be helpful to establish what the term Gnostic means as used in here. A recent work by A. Deconic presents a compelling new way of considering the words Gnostic spirituality in terms of emergent structures and cognitive frames. Especially, Deconic sets out an emergent frame structure of Gnostic spirituality comprising five complex concepts. And it makes sense to me that Gnosticism is kind of defined in these 5 different ways. There's the personal possession of gnosis. So again, it's to say that if you have a group of people and they believe in the idea of having this inner wisdom or of gnosis, then that check marks off the box that they are probably Gnostic. Number 2 is experiential knowledge of God through mystic practices. That's another checkmark box that we can give if we want to call a group of people Gnostics. The third checkmark box would be innate spiritualness within the individual. The fourth checkmark would be transgressive esotericism and hermeneutics. And the fifth would be a seekership outlook and quest orientation, which is to say that people who are considered Gnostics, they don't usually just say this is it and that's all, and then they end there. They're usually seeking something, continuous knowledge of the unlimited information that can come from gaining gnosis. And I would agree, those 5 different ways of looking at who Gnostics would be, I would probably check mark those boxes off too and say, yep, that's a Gnostic if they fit these 5 categories. This frame of categories is applied in a number of religious texts, groups, or movements, as opposed to describing one particular group or set of teachings. It is not an exclusive frame. There are a wide variety of systems developed within it, and they certainly do not all agree. For instance, there are certain people in, I think it's Mandean traditions, who would have said that Jesus was a sorcerer. And they certainly don't agree with people who might have been like in Setian traditions or Barbelloite traditions, who would say, Jesus has come as a great teacher. But yet both of those groups would be considered Gnostic because they do those 5 frames of categories that we just discussed. They're always seeking. We're all on the path of truth, man. You know what I mean? But nonetheless, Gnostics are varying groups, fit into these general categories, and that's the way that we understand them in the modern sense. So she is certainly correct on that, and so is DeConnick there. This book aims to present an even clearer picture of these texts and the group or community that wrote and used them, beyond relegating them to fringes as passing examples within a broad hermeneutical category. Who are the Julians or Jeuians? I know they're called the Books of Jeu with a J, but honestly, I've got this funny feeling it's probably Jeuians. Again, these books were called the Books of Jeu, and if you've read through them, what they describe ultimately is, as I said, the demiurge is being controlled by the all-knowing Father. A lot of people think of dualism and they think there's a good God and then there's this demiurge in Gnosticism, he's the bad God. But you can tell when you read the Nag Hammadi library that the all-knowing, ineffable Father, the spirit, the great mind in control of everything, is in control of everything, because we've got books like the Trimorphic Protonoia or Thunder Perfect Mind, which describe exactly that. Those particular Gnostic texts are about the all-knowing Father and his spirit in everything. Everything? Yes, everything. Like the all-knowing God is actually controlling the archons, and the archons don't even realize it. These things that might be negative in the world, we therefore kind of have to attribute back to the all-knowing God, and a lot of people don't like that. They don't like this idea that there's pain and suffering in the world that can be attributed to this evil demiurge, but also being navigated by the true God. And in the Books of Jeu, it describes exactly that. I'm giving a lot of commentary before going into this part 2 here of Aaron Evans' book, just because I know a lot of people haven't read the Books of Jeu. And again, the Books of Jeu specify very clearly, all-knowing Father, he's running shit. Demiurge is under his control. And so these are early sects of Christian who believe that, which might not necessarily be described as thoroughly in some of the regular Gnostic books that people usually hear about when they're reading things like the Gospel of Thomas, or again, things that might have been found in the Nag Hammadi library. So now that you've got that concept, again, Book of Jeu, discovered 200 years ago, discovered way before the Nag Hammadi library, describes the demiurge and how he's actually under control and being swayed by the all-knowing Father. And we, for the sake of this discussion and Aaron Evans's description of the Julians, we, as in to say scholars in general, are titling these people who wrote the Book of Jeu as the Julians. They don't necessarily call themselves the Julians, but we are calling them that. So when this next section says, who are the Julians? It's the people who wrote the Book of Jeu and described all that stuff about the demiurge. Okay, got it? All right, the text, I'll say one more thing. I know a lot of you are familiar with the Sethians, the Barbeloites, the Essenes, yada, yada, yada. The Mandeans, the Manichaeans. Well, welcome the Jeuians. Welcome the Jeuians to the floor. Here we go. The texts analyzed here represent both introductory works and in-depth ritual manuals for a distinct practicing religious group or community that has hitherto gone without a name or term to differentiate from other Christian Gnostic groups or texts. It does not match the description of any group known from the heresiologists, or indeed any system found in the Nag Hammadi library or other Christian Gnostic texts. As will be demonstrated throughout this book, this group embraces a distinct cosmology and soteriology, complete with a recognizable cast of divine and subdivine characters, and a set of developing but reasonably consistent mysteries and initiatory rituals. I'd like to say that as commentary as well. When you read through the Books of Jeu, like page after page after page of the Books of Jeu is just pretty much the words, and there was this God, his God is this name. And then he has 12 things under him, and their names are this, and their names are this, and their names are this. And it just writes it over and over again. So when she's saying the Books of Jeu have a recognizable cast of divine and subdivine characters with distinct cosmology and soteriology, that is because in those books, they list it all out. It's like those books itself is almost like a table of context spread out into its content, or content. Table of contents spread out into context. That's how they wrote that book. They laid out their table of contents, and then they fucking explained the shit. And they said, this is the name here, this is the name there, this is the name there, yada, yada, yada. I will mention, though, that in a lot of the Books of Jeu, the translations that have been converted into English, every time it comes to the section of what the all-knowing, ineffable God's name is, or what some of the entities' names are, they redacted those, and it pisses me off. I'd like to know how to pronounce the names of some of these gods in English, but if you do look at it in Coptic, and because usually you can find the Coptic translations right next to the English translations, at least if you look in Coptic, you can still find their names. I just have to learn Coptic and figure out how to pronounce that shit. Such a distinct group deserves a name to distinguish its beliefs and associated texts in scholarship. This is why they called them the Julians. What term members of the group may have used to refer to themselves is unknown, which is exactly what we deal with when we hear of the Sethians, the Barbeloites, yada, yada, yada. That's stuff we do, okay? When I say that stuff we do, I mean we keep naming all of these Christian sects based on what we think that they were different. We don't know. Maybe they were all one group. Maybe they were divided into only two groups. We don't know that yet. We're trying to research that shit, and then we've gone and named them 7, 8 different things. It is suggested that they faced persecution in the name of the Savior. But it is unclear whether they would have called themselves Christians, particularly since they do not refer to Jesus as the Christ. Heresiologists were known to give some Christian Gnostic groups titles, regardless of the group's own names for themselves. For instance, in the Apocalypse of James, they call themselves Nazareans, right? Some of these were based on the names of their founders, sometimes, such as Valentinians. They were named after Valentinus, however you say his name, Valentinus, or the Marcosians. However, there is no indication within the text being examined here, or any external historical records of the name of any specific leaders for this group. Other group titles arose from the names of figures that were important to the sect, such as the Sethians or the Barbeloites. Again, these aren't the names that they gave themselves. We call them that. See why this is important, and it's just the introduction? I'm reading this because I know how many people have asked that. How many people have been like, what really is a Gnostic? Who are these people? Are they different from these ones over here? Yada, 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 right? And it makes it that much more difficult to kind of understand Gnosticism when you've got a bunch of scholars just popping off names as if it's like the final consensus. of what these people should be called. For the group that used the Books of Jeu back in the day when they created these things in the Pistis Sophia, this seems to be the most logical path to follow, which is to say to call them the Jeuians, as they feature some fairly distinctive divine beings. At first glance, it might seem that Pistis Sophia is the most logical figure to give her name to the group. She plays a prominent role in some of the texts of the Askew Codex, and at least one scribe chose to give those texts a title with her name. However, despite this, she is not the most important figure in this group's teaching. In fact, as will be addressed later in this book, she is portrayed as an essentially powerless entity of the material realms. The texts in which she prominently appears seem to be late compositions, according to Aaron Evans, that is, and her story is particularly designed to address a competing religious movement. A better representative to distinguish this group of Julians from other Christian Gnostic movements is Jeu himself. This figure is the cosmic demiurge in the particular Books of Jeu, which is to say that in Nag Hammadi books, we usually call it the demiurge, but in the Books of Jeu, they gave him an actual name. They constantly say, he is, here's the demiurge. They don't really say the words, here is the demiurge, but they say, and his name is Jeu. This is the person who's in charge of some of the treasuries, and his name is Jeu. And you read through enough Gnostic texts, you can tell that the person that Jeu is the same as the demiurge. He populates the heights with his emanations and arranges all of the archons in the material realms. He plays a vital role from the earliest stages of the group's development, and he is unique to this body of texts. Thus, the term Jeuian has been selected as the descriptor for these texts and the group that wrote and used them. What are the Jeuian texts? The Jeuian texts extant today are found in two Coptic codices, known as the Bruce and Askew Codices. The dating of the text is unclear. Scholarship, I'm going to do air quotes when I say that, scholarship, tends to suggest that the present form of the documents originated in the late 4th and early 5th centuries of the Common Era. And why is it that I went when I said the word scholarship? Why did I emphasize it in that way? Because of the unfortunate reality that modern academia has been so tampered with, that the word scholarship is given to us to almost represent people who should be on the path of absolute truth and knowledge, bringing to us the facts, discovering things as they were, and yet modern academia has been known, for manipulating shit. There's battles in academia that you hear about all the time, kind of like the way that there are battles in the pharmaceutical industries, Money speaks. Money talks. Money does the walking, right? So I'm saying scholarship tends to suggest that these texts originated in the late 4th and early centuries, but notice that even Aaron Evans here has to say they tend to suggest. Not all of them do suggest that, because there are many people who look at the Gnostic texts and instead of believing what modern scholars suggest they are dated as, we could look at for example, a lot of these books are speaking as if it was the apostles who wrote them, right? So do we believe the books who are saying, hey, this is when we were written practically? Or do we believe modern scholars who are like, no, this is a pseudo book. It really wasn't written by the apostles. It must have been a later person. Sometimes that could be correct. But other times, I'm sure that there are some damn books when an author said, hey, I wrote this, that author actually did write it. But what's the narrative of scholarship, right? Sometimes the narrative is to find the truth, and other scholars tend to manipulate the truth. But for what it's worth, Aaron is expressing that these particular books could be dated to the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era. The date and even the original language of the texts from which these versions were translated or copied is less certain yet. See that? So we have found copies of things that could have been translated earlier, which is what a lot of the Nag Hammadi library has an issue with too. We find versions that are later on, And we're like, damn it, well, it's kind of like the Book of Matthew. Everybody else always wondered, is there a Hebrew version of the Book of Matthew? Is it always just the Greek Septuagint and the New Testament was just written in Greek first? You see what I mean? There's a chance that things could be a little bit earlier than what scholars want to feel happy with and admit. And I'm glad that Erin points that out. That's why I love what she does with this book, that even just in the introduction of her book, she's clarifying what we've always known, that they're not just called Gnostics, that it is that scholars have put their own titles on things, that yes, scholars are trying to discover the truth about things, but we're kind of working in the parameters of what modern scholarship will give to us now that the World Wide Web and the internet has allowed that much more people to dig into these topics, both scholars and laymen. And so, again, I'm glad that she not only clarifies these kind of things, even down to, allowing us to understand that we can date what we can, but we don't know if these things were copied from earlier things, even before so. It seems like they were written in Greek and originated in Egypt at a time when a number of Gnostic sects were flourishing, and origin sometime in the 3rd century is even probable. The texts themselves are commonly referred to as the Pistis Sophia and the Books of Jeu, although these titles are not original. Each of these texts contains multiple books or subdivisions, but how the texts relate to each other and where their contents should be divided is sometimes contested. Damn academia. Always contesting shit. For good cause, though. But each chapter of the present work deals with an individual book. It is important to establish from the outset how the broader texts should be divided. And that's why she said that that's what this book was going to do. She's taking the Books of Jeu and Pistis Sophia and she's breaking it down like a table of contents so we can fucking thoroughly go through these things and understand them. So first, we've got the Bruce Codex, the Books of Jeu. The contents and organization of the Bruce Codex are complicated. Its leaves were shuffled out of order from the time it was brought out of Egypt. Many of its pages have been missing from the time it was brought to the attention of modern scholarship. There have been debate as to the proper order of the leaves, and even the number and order of the books is originally contained. Then we've got Schmidt, who did study these books and made a critical edition of these books, and it says that his critical edition has been generally accepted for over a century, but recently there was another person named Krager, who has prepared a new edition of the Books of Jeu. And if you want, type in C. Smith, Bruce, Books of Jeu, or and PDF, or type in Kruger, Books of Jeu PDF, and you might be able to find some of their critical editions and study more of the Books of Jeu or read them yourself. I have very much so gone into Google and just typed in Books of Jeu PDF, and bam, it'll pop up right like that. Now, Schmidt, when he did his critical edition, divided the contents of these books into 2 works, the first and the second Books of Jeu, and together he called them the Books of Jeu. Together, calling them the Books of Jeu by modern scholarship, and then there was the untitled text. It was clear from both the contents and the handwriting that the untitled text that was found with these first and second books here is not actually directly associated with the Books of Jeu. The untitled text is not related to the group under examination here, yet they were all found together. That's kind of what the Nag Hammadi library was about. Having dug up so many Mandaean texts, also found with Manichaean texts, also found with Jewish texts, also found with, Pharisee-based information. It seems like it reminds me of the Library of Alexandria. These are libraries. That's why we call the Nag Hammadi library a library, because they weren't just books, all of just one simple theology or cosmology of Gnosticism. It was a library of different books. Whoever fucking collects these things and keeps burying them in pottery and clay pots and shit is doing them because they are collecting the books so that we have an actual library of these different books. The same thing happened here when they discovered the Books of Jeu 200 years before Nag Hammadi library ever came around. So again, for those of you who think that Nag Hammadi was when we discovered Gnosticism, no. No, no, no. They were discovered well before that. Okay, so within the remit of Schmidt's 2 Books of Jeu, there are 6 sections. They are all fragmentary, and he organizes these sections based on their contents. These 6 basic units of the text, given with Schmidt's page numbers, followed by Kruger's numbering in parentheses, are D1 to D4, which is a 4-page introductory sentence that begins with the statement, I have loved you, I have wanted to give you life, the living Jesus who knows the truth. And this section breaks off mid-sentence. Then we've got 1A to 4A of D1A, D4A, a second copy of the introductory statement written in another hand, which is also incomplete. Ooh, I always wondered about that. Sorry, whenever I've read the Books of Jeu, I read the introduction or the first section, and then it goes to the next section in the book, and it's the exact same thing. I'm like, what the hell? Why is it repeating itself? And that's when I started to realize, and thankfully she said it here, that when they discovered these copies, it's almost like the leaves that were inside of the actual codices. When they held those codices in their hands and they opened up those pages, they were like, oh, there's an introductory. And then they flip over to the next section and like, oh, damn, it's the same introductory. But now we get to see it was actually written by another person, but stuck in the same book. Then we've got the next section of the Book of Jeu, which is a discussion of the treasuries and how they are populated. And this is a really important part that I want to understand. The treasuries, okay? The treasuries. That is a concept that is really hard to understand because when you read through the Books of Jeu, a lot of the English parts are, I know I used the word redacted earlier, but they're kind of blanked out because it's like describing their names, their categories, and signs and symbols that were from a different language. So it's hard to put some of them into English. But thankfully, a lot of these study editions, again, when you're reading the Books of Jeu or the Pistis Sophia, thankfully these translators put the English like right next to the Coptic version. So I suppose people who know how to read Coptic get to actually look at some of these names of these treasuries and these entities and things like that. But I'm certainly curious to learn more about what the treasuries actually are. And I think that's what Aaron does in this book, because according to the table of contents, there is a section in this book that I have not yet read, which describes treasuries, their seals, their names, characters of the treasury rulers. And I mean, hey, with a word like the treasuries, it sounds very treasureful. Who wouldn't want to know about what the treasuries are? Especially if it's these books, again, are kind of like, in a humorous way, again, I say, these are like the books on how to defeat the demiurge and essentially go to freaking heaven. Who doesn't want to know how to get to heaven properly? Woo! It reminds me of the book of the Apocalypse of James, which I discussed in another video, that after James died, Jesus says, yo, just so you know, after you pass on, because you're about to get martyred. Poor James was like, damn it, I'm about to get martyred. He was stressing out. But Jesus is like, after you pass on, you're going to have to do something else. Your job's not over yet. You're going to have to go and face up against 3 watchers. 3 watchers who meet us all after the afterlife, or at least met James. So again, there's like, it's fascinating to see that there are some Gnostic texts that don't just talk about the creation of the world. Now, those are the books we all usually read. But there are Gnostic texts that talk about, okay, we've heard about the creation of the world. Now let's talk about what happens in the afterlife. And the Book of Jeu, that's one such book. All right, so yes, 5 to 34 again discusses the treasury. Then we've got a fragment, which is a hymn to the first mystery. And if you've ever read the Pistis Sophia, you might have heard about the mysteries. I mean, even in Catholicism, we are taught, like, say we are praying the rosary. Whenever you pray the rosary, you're supposed to dwell on the mysteries, right? You're praying for these mysteries to come into your life to be understood. He who hath an ear to hear and the eyes to see. To see what? The fucking mysteries. To understand what it was that these people were trying to tell us. And Jesus and his apostles and disciples were trying to tell us. And then we've got another section relating to 60 treasuries. And then in Kruger's case, he flips their order, and we've got a single leaf. On one side gives the beginning of a hymn that is relating to the ocean, and the other describes a part of the passage of the soul through the archons of the midst. And if you read the Book of Jeu, it's really cool. The midst is almost like this concept of like, not just as above, so below, but the way that it's kind of, honestly, to me, I may be mistaken about this, but it gives the vibes. It's like, I feel like a Valley girl when I'm saying this, but it's kind of like your higher self meeting up with what you do here on earth, and you bring the two together, and then you're like one person all of a sudden. You know? Have you ever heard of that? Have you ever heard of being in line with your higher self? That's kind of like what the midst is. It's almost like you tune yourself so much, or even like chakras in Hinduism. You tune yourself so much, you are so in line with what is above, what your higher self, what the all-knowing Father and Spirit is trying to tell you, that now you actually act doing what it's telling you. You bring yourself up to heaven, and it brings itself down to you. You operate as one. You're now in your highest self. And that is kind of like what the midst are, what the midst is, but also almost geographical. It's almost, I mean, it's kind of like that kind of a level is where I suspect that there is the ability to do things like astral projection, actually traveling in a different realm. Remember, these prophets, a lot of the time, and these people who are discussing such esoteric understandings, often received their information by doing two very important things. One, receiving visions when they're sleeping, and two, being caught up like Enoch, literally going and traveling and seeing something in this outer world. So while I say that, yes, there is sections of the Books of Jeu that describe this idea of the midst and you kind of coming into alignment with your higher self, that's not just to say that we are coming into alignment so that we can, manifest everything on here on earth that we want. It's usually such a skilled person, such a mystic person, that they have the ability to do these kind of things too. Travel to what could be considered the etheric midst, the geographical etheric midst. Okay, so that's the way that it's been broken down. And then we've got Schmidt's two books of Jeu. The present work endeavors, Aaron Evans' book endeavors how to explore these texts, how they came to be, working to determine how these texts were used and how they came together into this current form from earlier documents and ideas. It seeks to determine, her book, Aaron's book that she's written here, it seeks to determine the cultural and religious environment and background that produced these books of, such amazing information, and to find clues as to why the contents came to be in this format. In this analysis, certain of Schmidt's sections are found to be independent of the main two Books of Jeu fragments of separate works. For present purposes, then, this book is going to focus on the two Books of Jeu defined by the following organizations and boundaries of text. Book of Jeu, parts of Schmidt and Kruger. Second Book of Jeu, different areas of Schmidt and Kruger. Okay, so she's going to kind of analyze both of them, but by breaking down the two books in their own categories. Two Jeuian fragments from the Bruce Codex are also occasionally referenced, since these are not directly part of either of the Books of Jeu. To avoid confusion, we're going to be referring to this as BC Fragment 1, BC Fragment 2. And remember, again, when the Books of Jeu and the Pistis Sophia were discovered, that extra unknown fragment was also discovered with them, and so she's going to go over that. Okay, the repeated introduction. Remember how I told you at the beginning of the Books of Jeu, it gives you an introduction where Jesus is speaking. He's like, I have loved you. I've wanted to give you life, things like that. How it like reads that introduction, and then all of a sudden you're reading the rest of the Book of Jeu, and there's that introduction again. The writer or the scribe has it written in there twice. She says here, it is recognized as being independent of the Books of Jeu and the Jeuian system. Thus, it is not included in the analysis here. That's good to know. So when you're reading the Books of Jeu, if you ever see that introduction, recognize again that the Books of Jeu are kind of like a library in and of themselves. The introduction is even written by somebody separate. Sections 1 and 2 are fragments from a separate non-Julian work. Besides having different handwriting from the rest, they use language and themes that are not found anywhere else in Julian texts, consistently using terms like apostles instead of disciples, or titles like the Word of the Living Jesus. Section 3 uses images, themes, and organizational style referenced or found in the first part of the section before the title, and nowhere else. The outline diagrams of the individual treasuries, referring simply to the treasuries rather than the treasuries of light. So what she's basically saying is that there are different fragments within the Books of Jeu that you can tell were written by different people because the different handwriting and the different ways that they were using their language. Section 4 is considered a Julian fragment, independent from the Books of Jeu. Its depiction of the aeons contradicts the discussion of them found in Section 5, and it uses language and an aeon system that is common in the later Pistis Sophia, but which is not used in the rest of the Books of Jeu. So, Kruger's new critical edition provides the immense benefit of numbering the lines on each of the page, as found in the manuscript, which also, if you type in the Books of Jeu PDF in Google, you can see the same thing. However, because the present work proposes that the text consists of two separate books, and that the organization of their contents was originally slightly different from Kruger's analysis, the citations will also include the book titles listed above. So it's cool to number them, right? It's good that when we read through the Books of Jeu that they're numbered. It helps us in our modern scholarship to understand these things, but if some of the books are not necessarily related to one another, then are we numbering them correctly? Okay, so now that was the description of everything in the Bruce Codex. Remember, the Bruce Codex describing the Books of Jeu. We've got two main Books of Jeu, and we've got a couple fragments that seem to be a little bit more unknown. We discovered them all. Some of them are numbered, and we've got two main people who have really gone in depth to kind of do study editions on these books, and now Aaron Evans is kind of taking those two authors for what they are of major value and worth, and using those two critical editions of study that have been done on the Books of Jeu, and she's now breaking it down further. Now we've got the Askew Codex. The Askew Codex that was discovered along with this, the Books of Jeu, it holds the Pistis Sophia. So for those of you who thought the Pistis Sophia was just discovered in the Nag Hammadi Library, no, thank you. 200 years ago, Pistis Sophia was already discovered in what was called the Askew Codex. And thankfully, in contrast to the Bruce Codex, which we just, described for 20 fucking minutes of an introductory here, the Askew Codex with the Pistis Sophia, when they discovered it, it was largely completed. Chef's kiss. Thank you to those Gnostics back then who, took that little library, put it together, and kept the Pistis Sophia in good condition. And I'm sure thank you to caves and dirt and all that kind of stuff for kind of, not degrading those books like a lot of codexes would get. Pages are dissolving and falling apart and shit. It has a few lacunae, as well as a few fragmentary texts that are unrelated to and written in a different hand than the main composition, but overall the contents are in order and belong to the same group or community of believers. There has been some scholarly debate as to how these texts should be divided. There are some clear divisions where titles appear between texts, but in other instances, it's less immediately clear how the material should be grouped. General scholarly consensus of the Pistis Sophia acknowledges at least 4 divisions in the text, commonly known as Books 1 through 4. Some scholars propose as many as 6 subdivisions. The present work acknowledges 5 separate books, recognizing that extra lacuna in Book 4. Like I said, man, it's so valuable how she's breaking this down, letting us know just how much contentious debate goes on between scholars. Some people are like, there's 4. Now there's 6, right? And it lets us, as students of Gnosticism, students of Christianity, understand that sometimes modern scholarship, my brain wanted to joke and say, sometimes modern scholarship ain't shit. Obviously it is. I'm joking, but it just goes to show that modern scholarship is human. It's on the basis of humans really trying to figure things out, which means that there is margin for error. You know, it happens. We are learning. That's why we're studying these all. And so it's, say you had a book and a person was just like, there's only 4. That's it. That's all. It's kind of like looking at the Bible. There's only the King James Version. You should never look at any other version. And then lo and behold, you find out, oh, there are scholars who have like studied this and figured out this. And to give us a more thorough and whole understanding, it's sometimes good to get that outside perspective. And now you know. Now you've got a girl who put this wonderfully together that says, hey, you should know. You could recognize it as 5 separate books. Pay attention to the titles, she says. Sometimes there are clear divisions where the titles appear, right? And for the sake of it, I would say, start learning Coptic, everybody. Okay, so for her book, like she said, she's going to acknowledge 5 separate books, recognizing that a lacuna exists in book 4, and in fact encompasses a division between 2 disparate texts. The division and how all 5 books relate to each other will be discussed further in their corresponding chapters in the brief divisions, as are as follows. Remember, this is a 295-page book, researching every fucking chapter of the Pistis Sophia and the Books of Jeu. So I know I'm taking an hour to read this particular introduction for you in a rather unorthodox way, since I seem to be in a bit of a mind frame where I'm kind of cussing in this video here. Again, I said I wanted to break it down in layman's terms for people. But if you want to really learn about this Gnostic understanding, here you go, guys. Here's the map, you know, here's the groundwork laid out before you in a way that is absolutely amazing. Which would take me a 24-hour video if I wanted to go through every single chapter. I'm certainly going to read it all, but I would hope that you guys would. This book is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 covers the texts with the greatest focus on the rituals and the mysteries that form from the central core of the group's soteriological beliefs. It argues that these texts were most likely intended for use by priests and ritual officiants, those who have already been formally initiated into the fold, or those about to undergo initiation, depending on the text. They present evidence for multiple ranks of members with access to different levels of knowledge, group purification or initiation rites, and group liturgical practices, including call and response hymns. Part 2 of this book deals with texts concerned primarily with setting out proper ethical or lifestyle code for group members, as well as outlining punishments for those who transgress this code. It suggests that the target audience for these books was those who were still being instructed and undergoing preparation for the initiation process. Honey, are you okay? Oh my God. Are you okay? Wow. Oh my gosh. Sorry, guys. My baby just sat straight up from sleep with his eyes closed and literally started sleep talking. That was a really, really kind of wild thing to see. And now we are feeding. Okay, so now that I got a baby on the boob here, I'm probably going to cut this introduction short, snuggle with him a little bit, let him lull back to sleep, and ask you again, like I said, to check into this book, because I sure am going to. But I'm going to let my little buddy sleep a little bit here, since I'm chatting my butt off right next to him and probably waking him up like that. Poor guy. All right, take care, guys.